I was 28 when my life changed forever. My aunt, my only real family, passed away and left me everything: a Victorian estate, shares in a multi-million-dollar company, and over $14 million in liquid assets. I was still grieving when two strangers walked into the will reading. They smiled like they belonged there, but they didn't, because 15 years ago, they had left me behind with nothing but a note. That's right, my birth parents. The same people who abandoned me at 13 without so much as a goodbye suddenly reappeared, dressed nicely, with polished shoes and accompanied by a lawyer. What they said next left the entire room stunned. "We're still her legal guardians," they declared, trying to take everything my aunt had worked for, everything she gave me. But they didn't expect what happened next. Because the moment my lawyer stepped into the room, holding a folder Aunt Margaret had prepared years ago, their confidence evaporated. Their plan wasn't just bold, it was about to blow up in their faces. If you've ever wondered what happens when people who once abandoned you come crawling back for your success, this story will keep you watching until the end. It's not just about inheritance. It's about betrayal, family, justice, and the power of one woman to stand up and say, "No more. Stay with me. You won't believe what they tried next and how I made sure they never came back." Claire Thompson was 28 years old, single, and lived alone in a modest apartment in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. She worked as a junior project coordinator for a local architectural firm, a job that paid the bills but rarely stirred her spirit. Her days passed in the rhythm of spreadsheets, takeout dinners, and phone calls to no one. She had no siblings, few close friends, and only one person in the world she truly trusted: her aunt, Margaret Whitmore. That morning had begun like any other. Claire sat at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee, while scrolling through unread emails when her phone rang. It was the hospital. A quiet voice informed her that Margaret had passed away at dawn: pancreatic cancer. After 8 months of slow decline and quiet bravery, Margaret had finally let go. Claire didn't cry right away. Instead, she sat still for several minutes, hearing nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator. The woman who raised her, who took her in when no one else would, was gone. She reached for the small wooden box Margaret had given her years ago, containing old photos, a silver necklace, and a single yellowed letter Margaret once wrote but never sent. It had only one sentence: "You were the best decision I ever made." The next day, Claire stood outside a law office in downtown Harrisburg, clutching a leather folder and her late aunt's scarf. The scarf still smelled faintly of lavender and coffee. Harold Blake, Margaret's longtime friend and attorney, greeted her at the door. He was in his 70s, thin with silver-rimmed glasses and a steady, composed demeanor. Harold had known Margaret for over 40 years and had handled all her legal affairs, including the upcoming reading of her will. In the privacy of his office, Harold explained that this was not the formal will reading that would take place next week, but he wanted to meet Claire personally to go over the basics and help her prepare. His voice softened when he said, "Your aunt loved you deeply, Claire. She considered you her daughter in every way that mattered." Claire nodded silently. She wasn't ready to talk yet. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her eyes stayed fixed on the desk, as if looking too directly at Harold would somehow confirm Margaret's absence. Then Harold gently slid a stack of documents toward her. "Margaret has left her entire estate to you." Claire blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Harold gave a small nod. "She left you everything: her home in Laurel Hill, her shares in Whitmore Interiors, and approximately $7 million in liquid assets. She appointed you sole beneficiary and executor." The words hit Claire like a storm. Her hands trembled as she reached for the papers. She could barely register what she was reading. The grand old Victorian home with blue shutters that Margaret had restored herself, the design firm Margaret founded 20 years ago and ran until her final illness, and the substantial savings that no one, least of all Claire, had ever suspected. "I don't understand," Claire said softly. "Why me?" Harold looked at her, his voice firm but kind. "Because she trusted you. Because she knew what you'd do with it." Claire leaned back, dazed. Her mind reeled. She hadn't expected anything more than maybe a piece of jewelry, a few keepsakes, perhaps the photo albums. She'd never asked for more, and never thought she'd receive it. Margaret had never spoken much about her finances or her business. She was a quiet, deliberate woman, generous in action but private in word. Claire always assumed the estate would go to distant cousins, charities, maybe even to her business partners. "I don't even know what to do with all of this," Claire murmured. It's too much." Harold smiled faintly. "You don't have to decide today. We'll take it step by step." Still in disbelief, Claire nodded. She took the documents, thanked Harold, and rose to leave. As she reached the door, Harold spoke again, more carefully this time. "There will be a formal reading of the will next week," he said. "You should be there, and others might be too." Claire turned slowly. "Others?" He didn't elaborate, but his tone carried weight. "Just be ready." Margaret anticipated some resistance. The air in the office changed. Claire gave a slow nod, thanked him again, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. Her heart was still heavy with grief, but now it was tangled with uncertainty. That evening, back in the quiet of her apartment, Claire sat in her bedroom staring at the old wooden wardrobe Margaret once gave her. As she opened the bottom drawer to put away her scarf, something caught her eye, a glint of brass. Tucked beneath a stack of linens was a small metal box with a keyhole. Claire pulled it out gently, her breath catching. She hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps she had forgotten. The box was old, ornate, and clearly important. On the top was carved a single initial, M. She turned it in her hands, wondering what was inside. For a moment she considered prying it open, but something told her to wait. Margaret had always said, "The truth will come when you're ready." Claire placed the box gently on her nightstand. Next week everything might change again, but tonight she simply needed to breathe. Claire spent the next several days in a fog of quiet reflection. After leaving Harold's office, she had gone home, placed the box from Margaret on her nightstand, and barely left her apartment. She moved through her days as if underwater, completing paperwork, answering condolence messages, and replaying the last conversation with Harold in her mind. The idea that others would be at the formal will reading lingered like a shadow she couldn't quite name. On the morning of the reading, she woke early, dressed in a simple black blouse and skirt, and tucked an old photograph of her and Margaret into her purse. It was from her high school graduation, Margaret standing tall and proud, her hand resting firmly on Claire's shoulder. That picture, more than any document, reminded Claire of where she belonged. She took a deep breath, looked at herself in the mirror, and whispered, "You've got this." Harold's office was the same as before, dimly lit, orderly, and filled with the scent of aged wood and old books. Claire arrived 10 minutes early, as always. The receptionist, a kind woman in her 60s named Beth, offered her a glass of water and a quiet smile. Claire declined both. She needed to stay alert. Harold greeted her in the hallway, his face composed but more serious than usual. "Glad you made it, Claire," he said. "There's something I should tell you before we begin. We have additional attendees today." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of attendees?" Harold hesitated. "Your biological parents, Dennis and Susan Thompson. They arrived with legal counsel. Apparently they saw Margaret's obituary in the local paper and learned about the estate. I know this is unexpected." Her stomach tightened. She hadn't spoken to or seen her parents since she was 13, the day she woke up alone in their old apartment, a note left in their absence, and no one coming back. For 15 years, their absence had become a scar she wore in silence. Now? They were back? Now? Claire followed Harold down the hallway in silence. As they entered the large meeting room, the air changed instantly. Seated at the long, polished table were a man and woman in their early 50s. Dennis wore a gray suit, his tie slightly askew. Susan had on a pale blue blouse, tasteful jewelry, and an uneasy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Beside them sat a man in a navy blazer, younger, likely their attorney. Claire froze in the doorway. "Claire," Susan said first, rising slightly, her voice syrupy. "Sweetheart. My goodness, it's been so long." Claire didn't respond. Her grip tightened on her purse. Dennis stood too. We didn't know how to reach you, but when we saw the obituary, we wanted to be here." Harold gestured to the seats. "Let's begin, shall we?" Claire took the chair farthest from them and said nothing. Harold began reading portions of the will, the legal language thick and formal. He emphasized that Margaret had appointed Claire as sole heir and executor of her estate, without conditions or secondary beneficiaries. The moment Harold said, "Claire Thompson is to inherit the full extent of the estate," Susan cleared her throat and leaned forward. "We don't mean to interrupt," she said, "but we do have some concerns." Harold looked up steely. "Go on." Susan's tone softened. "We understand Margaret loved Claire deeply. That's clear. But we are her biological parents. We never signed away our guardianship formally. We were never legally stripped of our rights. We think this will may require further review, especially considering Claire was still a minor when she went to live with Margaret." Claire sat motionless. The words stung, even as her expression remained blank. Biological parents, guardianship, 15 years of silence, and now they came with polished shoes and legal claims? Dennis nodded. "We just want to make sure everything is in Claire's best interest, that her future is protected. Legally, I mean." Claire turned her gaze toward Harold, her voice steady but low. "They left me. They vanished. I haven't heard from them in 15 years. Susan's eyes glistened suddenly, as if on cue. "We had our reasons. Health, financial struggles, we were ashamed. We always hoped to make it right one day. But then Margaret stepped in." Harold didn't flinch. "Thank you for sharing that. However, as I've stated, Margaret made very clear arrangements, and I assure you this document was prepared with full legal oversight." The lawyer beside Dennis shifted forward. "We're not disputing Margaret's affection for Claire. We're simply asking the court or your office to review whether the transfer of guardianship was ever legally formalized. If not, there may be grounds for reconsideration." Claire stared at her parents. They looked clean, rested, well-fed. Susan wore a gold watch. Dennis's shoes were new. The people who had abandoned her in a one-bedroom apartment with an empty fridge and a sticky note now sat across from her speaking about her best interest. She wanted to scream. Instead, she stayed silent. Harold closed the folder before him, calm and precise. "Thank you. We'll pause the reading for today. I will review all necessary documentation, including guardianship status, and respond formally. I believe it would be in everyone's best interest not to continue this discussion without further review." Dennis opened his mouth, but Harold held up a hand. "That's all for today." Claire stood slowly, placing the photo of her and Margaret face down on the table as she gathered her things. She didn't look back. Outside the office, she let the cold October air fill her lungs. She didn't cry, not yet, but inside, something had shifted. Whatever game they were playing, they had just made their move, and she intended to answer it. Claire hadn't planned on remembering. After the will reading, she had promised herself she wouldn't fall back into the past, that the only way to keep her strength was to focus forward. But the moment she stepped into her quiet apartment, the door clicking shut behind her, the silence made it impossible not to remember. It began with the sound of footsteps, her own walking across the faded carpet of that one-bedroom apartment where she'd lived with her parents until she was 13. The memory came uninvited, like a reel unspooling in the back of her mind. She saw the hallway again, narrow and dim, with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of stale coffee in the air. That morning had started like any other. She had rolled out of bed expecting to see the TV on, her dad's coffee mug on the counter, her mom brushing her hair in the kitchen window. Instead, the apartment was still. Too still. Claire had walked from room to room, calling their names. At first, just softly, then louder. There were no voices, no footsteps, no familiar morning clatter. Their bedroom door stood ajar, the bed made, the drawers half empty. And on the kitchen table sat a yellow sticky note with 7 words scribbled in her father's careless handwriting. "Aunt Margaret will take care of you." Nothing else. No explanation. No goodbye. She'd called her mom's phone first, straight to voicemail, then her dad's. The number was already disconnected. She tried the neighbors, then the school, even the diner her mother sometimes worked at on weekends. No one had seen them. The hours passed. By dusk, she was curled up on the floor, the old landline pressed against her ear, redialing the same numbers over and over again. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the door with her backpack, thinking maybe they would come back, say it had all been a mistake. They didn't. By the second day, the landlord came by to check on the unit and found Claire alone. Alarmed, he called social services. She was taken to a youth holding facility, what they called a temporary placement center for children in transition. It was a squat concrete building with gray walls and beds that smelled like metal and detergent. The staff was kind enough but distant. She shared a room with 2 other girls. At night, she curled up on the edge of her cot, clutching a threadbare teddy bear a volunteer had handed her when she arrived. It smelled of someone else's perfume. No one told her where her parents had gone. No one promised they would come back. She stayed in that place for a full week. It felt longer. She didn't speak much. She didn't eat much. On the 5th night, one of the girls in her room asked if she wanted to run away. Claire didn't answer. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting them until the morning light returned. On the 7th day, Margaret appeared. Claire remembered the moment with strange clarity. Margaret stood in the doorway of the center, wearing a navy coat, her hair pinned neatly as always, holding a clipboard. She didn't smile. She didn't run to embrace Claire. She simply said, "Get your things. You're coming with me." There were no warm greetings, no tears. Margaret signed papers with clinical precision. When Claire asked what had happened to her parents, Margaret responded with a tight jaw, "They're not coming back." Claire had sat in the passenger seat of Margaret's car, her fingers twisting the edge of her shirt, waiting, hoping for more explanation. But Margaret drove in silence. When they arrived at her home, she showed Claire to the guest bedroom, told her the rules, and left her alone. Claire cried into the pillow that night, but not for her parents, for something harder to name, for the empty space where love should have been. In the months that followed, Claire went through the motions. She went to school. She said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am." Margaret fed her, clothed her, made sure she did her homework, but she didn't speak much, and she never once asked Claire how she felt. Claire, for her part, didn't speak much either. She had learned quickly that feelings weren't part of the arrangement. Still, every day for 6 months, Claire checked the mailbox. On her way home from school, she'd stop and open the little metal door, aching for a letter, a birthday card, a postcard, anything. But it was always empty. Eventually, she stopped checking. Not because she no longer cared, but because caring hurt too much. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table eating in silence, Claire worked up the courage to ask, "Do you think they'll write?" Margaret didn't look up from her plate. She simply replied, "They had their chance." A few weeks later, when Claire brought up her mother again, just her name, Margaret's expression changed. She set down her fork, folded her napkin carefully, and said in a low, firm voice, "We don't talk about them. They made their decision. It's time you made yours." Claire never mentioned them again. Now, 15 years later, sitting in her apartment, Claire could still feel the sting of that memory. Not just the day she was abandoned, but every day after. The long silence, the growing doubt, the moment when she stopped believing that family meant forever. She rose slowly and walked to the window, staring out at the dusky skyline. She thought of the people who had reappeared in Harold's office like ghosts, polished, polite, ready to rewrite history. But she remembered the truth, every second of it, and she would not let them take that away. Claire stood by the window long after night had fallen, her arms folded tightly as if shielding herself from something that still lingered in the air. Remembering what had happened at 13 had unearthed more than sorrow. It had awakened something dormant, something that had been buried beneath years of routine and careful distance. And now, in the silence of her apartment, her mind traveled back to the early days in Margaret's home, not with pain this time, but with a tenderness she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. When Claire first arrived at Margaret's house, everything was different. The walls were clean, the furniture polished, the shelves lined with hardback books in precise alphabetical order. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 in the morning, whether she was hungry or not. Television was off limits after 9. Dinner was always eaten at the table. No phones, no distractions, only conversation about current events or a book Margaret had assigned her to read. Claire hated it. She was used to chaos, to unpredictability, to half-eaten pizza boxes on counters, and her father's voice booming over late-night sitcoms. In Margaret's world, everything had order, structure. Claire felt like a visitor in a museum. She resisted in every way she could. She pretended to forget the breakfast time, refused to practice the piano, even skipped school twice in her first month. Each time, Margaret reacted with the same unnerving calm. No yelling, no threats. Just that steady look behind her reading glasses and a quiet, "You'll still eat at 7 tomorrow, and you'll go to school." Claire pushed harder, hoping for a reaction. She didn't want kindness. She didn't believe in it. She wanted to be punished, rejected, sent away. That would have made sense. That would have matched what she already knew about family. But Margaret never sent her away. Instead, when Claire came home crying one afternoon after failing a math quiz, expecting scolding, Margaret sat her down, poured her a glass of orange juice, and said, "I've already called a tutor. You'll meet twice a week until you feel more confident. And no, you're not stupid, you're just learning. That's what school is for." Claire didn't know how to respond. No one had ever done that before, responded to failure with help, not shame. She didn't thank Margaret then, but that evening, she practiced her piano without being reminded. There were other moments, small ones, but they carved deep into her memory. Like the time Margaret stayed up until midnight trying to learn how to cook Claire's favorite chicken salad, something her mother used to buy pre-packaged from the gas station down the street. The kitchen had filled with smoke, the lettuce was soggy, and the chicken overcooked, but Margaret had smiled awkwardly, her apron stained, and placed the bowl in front of Claire as if it were a 5-star meal. "It's terrible," Claire had said through a laugh. "I'll do better next time," Margaret replied, wiping her hands. Claire didn't realize it then, but that was the night she started to see Margaret not just as a strict guardian, but as someone really trying to care in ways Claire didn't yet know how to receive. It didn't happen all at once. There were still rough days, slammed doors, tears muffled into pillows, but gradually the edges softened. Claire found herself speaking more at dinner, asking Margaret for help with essays, accepting rides to school even when she could have taken the bus. She started calling her Aunt Margaret with less stiffness, and eventually just Dee, said with ease, without thought. By the time she turned 16, Claire no longer felt like a guest in the house. It was her room, her books on the shelf, her extra toothbrush in the cabinet beside Margaret's. There was safety there. A quiet rhythm, a certainty she hadn't known she needed until she had it. Now, standing in her apartment as the memories resurfaced, Claire felt something catch in her throat. She walked slowly to her closet, where she had kept a few of Margaret's belongings since the funeral. One of them was the lavender cardigan Margaret always wore on cool mornings. As she reached for it, her hand brushed against the back panel of the shelf, and something shifted behind it. Curious, Claire knelt and pulled the shelf back slightly. There it was, the box. She had seen it once before, in Margaret's bedroom, years ago. A small, sturdy metal box with a delicate keyhole engraved with Margaret's initials. Claire had forgotten it, or maybe she had just never let herself think too much about it. But now, it seemed to hum with importance. She brought it to the bed, running her fingers across the surface. It was heavier than she remembered. Her heart beat a little faster, not out of fear, but anticipation. She didn't open it yet. She didn't know why, but something told her that when she did, her world might shift again. For now, it was enough to hold it, to know it had waited for her, quietly, just like Margaret had. And in that moment she whispered, not to the box, but to the memory of the woman who had raised her with quiet discipline and even quieter love. "You weren't just my aunt, you were my mother, and I was yours." Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the box still in her lap, unopened, Her fingers traced the metal outline again and again, but she didn't move to unlock it. Not yet. There was something she needed to do first. A question that had been pressing on her chest since that day at Harold's office. Why now? Why did they come back? And what, if anything, did they expect from her? She didn't want answers to forgive them. She didn't believe they deserved that. But she needed to see them face to face, to look them in the eye, not as a child begging for love, but as a grown woman who had learned to stand without them. So when Dennis and Susan asked for a dinner to talk things over, Claire surprised even herself by saying yes. They met at a quiet Italian restaurant on the edge of town. It was neither cheap nor luxurious, neutral territory. Claire arrived 5 minutes early and requested a table near the window. She wore a navy blouse and simple black slacks, her hair tied back, minimal makeup. She wanted to look calm, controlled. She didn't want pity or confrontation, just clarity. Dennis and Susan arrived together. Claire watched them from across the room as they entered. He looked older, with deeper lines around his eyes and a slight limp. Susan was thinner than Claire remembered, with carefully styled hair and a scarf that looked more expensive than it should have been. They smiled when they saw her, too widely. "Claire," Susan said, moving to hug her before hesitating at the last second. Claire didn't move, and the moment passed awkwardly. They all sat down. The waiter took their drink orders. Claire asked for water. Susan requested tea, Dennis a coffee, and then they were alone. Dennis cleared his throat first. "We're grateful you agreed to meet. We didn't know if you'd even want to see us." "I'm listening," Claire replied, her voice even. Susan looked down at her napkin, folding it slowly. "There's so much to say, so much we did wrong, but the truth is, we were in a bad place back then. Financially, emotionally." Dennis nodded. "I'd lost my job. Susan was battling depression. We were drowning in debt. We thought Margaret could give you what we couldn't." Claire said nothing. The words fell flat. If they expected sympathy, they wouldn't find it here. Susan continued, her voice softer. "It wasn't easy, leaving, but we told ourselves it was for the best, that you'd be better off." "You left a note," Claire said, her tone low. 7 words. No contact, no check-ins. For 15 years. Susan blinked. "We were ashamed," Dennis shifted. "We followed your life from a distance. Newsletters, online mentions. We always knew Margaret took good care of you." Claire tilted her head. "So you stayed gone? Out of respect?" Neither of them answered. Then the shift came. It was subtle, but Claire saw it. Dennis leaned in slightly. Susan's eyes darted to her purse, then back to Claire. "We were sorry to hear about Margaret," Dennis said. "It must have been overwhelming, managing all this on your own. She left you everything, didn't she?" Susan added. "The house, the business, and financials?" Claire didn't blink. "You didn't come here to apologize. You came to ask." Dennis hesitated. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable, just Susan's been having health issues. We don't have insurance. Treatment's expensive." Susan looked down again, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "It's not cancer, but it's serious. We've been trying to keep up, but things are hard." Claire watched her mother's eyes shift away as she spoke. She caught the flicker of guilt, or was it calculation, and knew in that moment that nothing had changed. The same people who had vanished without a word were now crafting a narrative to justify re-entry. They didn't care about her life. They cared about her money. Claire said nothing. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. Instead, she folded her hands calmly on the table and stared at them. Let the silence do the talking. Eventually, Susan cleared her throat. "We're not trying to manipulate you." "I know," Claire said quietly. "You're just trying to survive, like always." The rest of the meal passed in forced pleasantries. Claire didn't touch her food. They asked about her work, her routines, her plans for the house. She answered politely but distantly. When the check came, Claire paid it. She didn't offer hugs as they left. She simply nodded, then walked to her car. Back at home, the apartment was dark except for the small reading lamp in her bedroom. Claire took the box from the bed and placed it gently on her desk. She reached for the tiny key Harold had given her weeks ago. He'd mentioned Margaret had asked for it to be delivered posthumously. She slid it into the lock. It clicked. Her breath caught as she lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were documents. At the top was an envelope addressed in Margaret's handwriting. To be opened by Claire only. Beneath it, she saw folders, legal ones, and one sheet caught her eye immediately. A notarized certificate titled Adoption Confirmation. Her hands began to tremble. She pulled it out slowly, eyes scanning the page. Claire Whitmore, legally adopted by Margaret Whitmore. Signed, dated, witnessed. She wasn't just the child Margaret raised. She was, in every legal and binding sense, her daughter. Behind that were more papers, financial records, letters, even a ledger noting a payment made to Dennis and Susan 15 years ago. But Claire didn't go through it all yet. She simply leaned back in her chair, one hand covering her mouth, the other gripping the certificate. They had abandoned her. But Margaret had claimed her, and no one could take that away. Claire sat motionless for what felt like hours, the dim lamplight casting long shadows across her bedroom walls. The certificate of adoption lay in front of her, its bold legal font more final and undeniable than any emotion she had ever felt. Margaret hadn't just raised her. She had fought for her, claimed her, made her family not just through time and sacrifice but through the law. Claire hadn't known. Margaret had never once said a word. And now, the truth was sitting in her lap like a silent guardian, waiting to be understood. She reached back into the metal box, careful not to disturb the stack of documents too roughly. The next folder was thinner, labeled in Margaret's tidy cursive, Financial Transaction, Private. Inside was a simple letter, dated 12 years ago. Margaret had written it to her attorney, outlining a payment made to Dennis and Susan Parker, Claire's biological parents, for the amount of $50,000. Claire's breath hitched as she scanned the page. The letter described how the money had been wired to an account under Dennis's name. Attached was a copy of the wire receipt. The money had come from Margaret's sale of preferred stock in her company shares she'd held for over a decade, meant to remain untouched. Selling them had cost her not just financially, but also control over a key voting share in her business. Yet she had done it without hesitation, just to make sure Claire would be safe, legally hers. At the back of the folder was a scan of the release document, signed by Dennis and Susan, dated just weeks before Claire's 16th birthday. A lawyer had notarized it. 2 witnesses had signed it. It was real. Claire shook her head, almost in disbelief. They had signed her away, quietly, without a fight, for money. And then they had stayed gone for over a decade until the moment there was something more to take. As she set the papers down, Claire's fingers brushed another folder, one that looked more recent. It wasn't Margaret's handwriting on the label this time, it was Harold's. Surveillance and background, requested. She opened it slowly. Inside was a professional report prepared by a private investigator. Photographs, typed notes, summaries of interviews. Claire turned the first page and felt her heart sink deeper. Over the years, Dennis and Susan had approached at least 3 other people, 2 elderly couples and a young widow, with claims that they were family or friends in need. In 2 cases, they had successfully convinced those people to lend them money amounts ranging from $10,000 to $30,000 by exploiting stories of long-lost children, illnesses, and fabricated tragedies. Only 1 case had resulted in legal charges, which were dropped when the victim declined to testify. The photos showed Dennis laughing with one of the elderly men outside a diner, Susan hugging a woman at a bus stop. In each image, they were performing a script, a show of concern, familiarity, and warmth. And behind each scene now revealed in these records was manipulation, deceit. Claire pressed her hand to her chest. The truth was heavier than she expected, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she had feared since the dinner. They hadn't changed. Not at all. They were opportunists. always had been. And she had almost allowed herself to believe they might be more. Still holding the folder, Claire walked to the window. The night was quiet, the street outside almost empty. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She remembered Margaret's voice now, steady, unwavering. Let your decisions come from truth, not fear. Margaret had said it to her the night before a big exam, but it fit this moment even more. The truth was here, black and white, ink and signature. Margaret had saved her twice, once by taking her in, and once by giving her a legal identity that couldn't be stolen or contested. Claire wasn't vulnerable. Not anymore. She returned to her desk, carefully stacking the papers back into the box, and closed the lid with care. Then she reached for her phone. Harold answered after the second ring. His voice was calm but alert, as if he already knew why she was calling. "Claire, I opened the box," she said. "A pause. And? I understand everything now." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. "I'd like to meet," she added. "Tomorrow, if possible." "Of course. 9:00, he replied. "I've scheduled a session, just you and me at first. Then, the others." Claire nodded, more to herself than to the voice on the other end. "Thank you, Harold." She ended the call and sat quietly for a while, staring at the box one last time. What had once felt like a mystery now felt like armor. She wasn't the abandoned girl they had hoped to reclaim. She was the daughter Margaret had chosen legally, financially, emotionally, and tomorrow, the rest of the world would have to accept it too. Claire stepped into Harold's office precisely at 9 the next morning. The hallway had been quiet, the sun pouring through the tall windows along the corridor, casting long rectangles of light across the carpet. She had rehearsed her breathing during the drive, counted to 5, held, released. But now, standing in the doorway to the conference room, her spine straightened on its own. She didn't feel small anymore. Harold stood as she entered, nodding silently, then gestured toward a high-backed chair across from him. Claire took the seat without hesitation. To her left sat an empty chair. Across the table were 2 others, both already occupied. Dennis looked older than he had the night before. His tie was too tight for his thick neck, and the skin around his eyes was puffier than she remembered. Susan wore a cream blouse and a faintly trembling smile. Their lawyer, a stiff man in a gray suit with 2 white teeth, sat beside them, tapping a pen cap against his folder. No one spoke right away. Then Harold leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "Let's begin." The opposing lawyer opened his file. "My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, have requested clarification and consideration regarding the estate of the late Margaret Whitmore. They believe—" "She wasn't Margaret Whitmore to my client," Harold interrupted calmly. "She was her legal mother." The lawyer blinked. "There appears to be no public record of that. That's because it was sealed after the adoption was finalized. But we'll unseal it today." Harold opened his own folder and slowly placed a stamped, notarized copy of the adoption certificate onto the table. He slid it forward. Claire kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady. Dennis leaned forward, squinting at the document. Susan said nothing. "Claire was legally adopted at the age of 16, Harold continued, with the full consent of both biological parents, here, and here." He placed the signature pages in front of the attorney. "Notarized, witnessed, properly filed. This document is uncontested and legally binding. You can challenge it, of course, but you won't win." The lawyer hesitated. "My clients were under duress at the time. Financial strain, emotional instability. It's possible they were manipulated into agreeing." Dennis shifted in his seat, his voice rough. "Margaret, she made promises. She said she'd help us if we let Claire go." "She did," Harold said, unmoved. "She gave you $50,000 from her own company shares. I have the bank records and the wire transfer details. They match the day you signed away your parental rights." Claire felt Susan glance toward her, but she didn't return it. Her gaze stayed fixed on the table, expression calm, almost detached. "I also have this," Harold added, placing a slim file in the center, A private investigation commissioned by Margaret 6 years ago as part of updating her estate planning. It contains background on your client's activities, including 3 separate incidents of financial manipulation involving vulnerable individuals, 2 of which involved fabricated familial connections. The lawyer reached out slowly, flipping through the file. Photos, notes, recordings. Dennis's nostrils flared. "You spied on us?" Margaret was protecting her daughter, Harold said. "And now I am." Susan finally spoke, her voice soft, eyes glistening. "Claire, sweetie, this isn't what you think. We were lost. We didn't know what we were doing, but we never stopped loving you." Claire turned her head slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but firm. "You didn't just walk away. You sold me. And then you stayed gone, until money came back into the picture." Susan began to weep quiet, controlled, one hand to her chest, the other reaching across the table as if distance alone explained the years of absence. Claire didn't flinch. Harold waited a beat, then slid forward one last item, a handwritten page aged slightly at the corners. "Margaret left a journal," he said. "Not for legal purposes, but for clarity. For Claire, I'll read the last entry if I may." He didn't wait for permission. "If they ever come back, tell Claire this. I did what I did to protect her. The world doesn't give orphaned girls the luxury of naivety. Let her know the truth. Let her be armed." He folded the page neatly and placed it beside the others. Dennis stood up abruptly, sending his chair back with a screech. "This is a setup," he snapped. "You're trying to paint us like criminals. We just wanted to make sure she's okay. That's all." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Then you have your answer. She is. And if there's any further attempt to claim or manipulate any portion of this estate, I will file not just civil countersuits but formal charges for attempted fraud." Dennis looked toward his attorney, who was now very quiet. Susan, tears drying on her cheeks, murmured, "We should go." Claire didn't move as they gathered their things. Dennis threw one final glance toward her, an ugly, unreadable look, but said nothing. As the door closed behind them, Harold sat back with a long breath. "You did well," he said. Claire nodded once. "Thank you." She rose, gathered the papers gently, and walked toward the window. The sun had risen higher. For the first time in a long time, her shadow stretched out long and clear behind her, unshaken, uninterrupted. It was a quiet afternoon when Harold called again. His voice, as always, was steady, but there was something in his tone this time, something more cautious than usual. "I believe there's something you need to see," he said. "Something Margaret uncovered but never had the chance to share with you. She left it with me. I think it's time." Claire met him later that day at his office, where he handed her a thin folder. Unlike the heavy stacks of legal documents from before, this one was marked simply, "Personal Inquiry, Parker Family, 2003. She opened it slowly, the air in the room thick with unspoken tension. Inside were typed pages from a private investigator, photos, dates, court filings. At first, Claire wasn't sure what she was looking at. The names were different. The location was in a small town in Illinois, but then she saw it. Ryan Parker, born the 28th of March 2000, abandoned July 2000. Her hand froze over the page. The name burned into her mind. Ryan, another child, her brother, left behind, just as she had been but even earlier. He was just 4 months old when their parents walked away from him. Claire scanned the report. Ryan had grown up in foster care. He'd been placed in 3 different homes by the time he turned 6. At 17, he dropped out of high school. Arrested once for minor possession. At 19, he entered a court-mandated rehab program for alcohol dependency. The last entry noted his current employment: laborer at a construction company in Indiana. No family contacts on file. Still listed as a ward of the state until age 18. Then forgotten. Forgotten. Claire sat back in her chair, the folder open in her lap. Her ears rang with the same question looping over and over in her mind. How could they do this to 2 children? Not once, but twice. Harold remained quiet, watching her carefully. Margaret found out about him 10 years ago, he finally said. But she didn't want to burden you. You were only 18 then. She believed some truths needed time. Claire nodded slowly. She was right. Later that night, she found herself looking up Ryan online. It wasn't easy. He didn't have a social media presence, and what records existed were mostly outdated. But after hours of digging, she found a recent photo from a local charity construction project. He stood off to the side in the background, tall, thin, the same sloping shoulders and tired eyes she remembered seeing in her own reflection during her foster care days. The resemblance was uncanny and unsettling. The next morning, she made the drive to Indiana. She didn't tell Harold, didn't make a plan, just drove. The address listed for Ryan led her to a small, run-down apartment complex near the edge of town. She parked across the street and watched from her car. After about an hour, she saw him. He emerged from the building in dusty jeans and a work jacket, climbed into a beat-up truck, and drove off. Claire followed at a distance. He stopped by a local diner, picked up coffee, then headed to a construction site near a strip mall. She stayed in the background, watching him work hauling boards, moving equipment, wiping sweat from his brow. There was a heaviness to his movements, a man carrying years of weight. But he smiled at his coworkers, helped a new guy with a measurement, laughed at a joke, head tilted slightly like hers when she tried not to show too much emotion. She didn't speak to him that day, or the next. Instead, she asked Harold to help her quietly. Through an anonymous charitable fund, she arranged for the landlord of his building to offer him a rent reduction for 6 months. Then she contacted a local trade school and paid the tuition for a 2-year certification program in construction management under a generic scholarship fund. She never signed her name. The week after the scholarship confirmation went through, she received a letter in her post office box. It was handwritten, awkward, slightly messy. To whoever helped me, I don't know who you are or why you did this, but no one's ever done something like this for me before. I've spent most of my life waiting for people to leave, and now someone's made me feel like maybe I matter. Thank you. I won't waste it. Tenon. Claire read the letter 3 times. She didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she folded it carefully, placed it in a wooden box on her nightstand, the same box where she kept Margaret's last note, and sat down on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. Ryan didn't know he had a sister, but she knew she had a brother. And for now, that was enough. It was just after sunset when Claire heard the knock. She was in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had already gone cold. Outside, the sky had shifted into a dusky blue, and the garden lights along the path leading up to the front door flickered on automatically. She had been expecting quiet. Instead, she got them. Through the security monitor by the hallway, she saw Dennis and Susan standing on the porch. Claire's stomach tightened. They hadn't contacted her since the legal confrontation 2 weeks ago. No calls, no letters, no lawyers. She had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that they'd finally gone. She stood in silence for a moment, unsure whether to open the door at all. Then, calm and deliberate, she pressed the intercom. Yes? Susan's voice cracked through the speaker. Claire, we're not here to argue. Please, we just want to talk. Just a few minutes. Claire didn't answer. She unlocked the door, stepped into the entryway, and opened it, but left the security chain hooked. She stood there, behind the partial opening, her eyes steady. Dennis stepped forward slightly. We didn't come to fight. We've thought a lot about everything. We want to make peace. For real this time. Claire looked from one face to the other. The fake sincerity wasn't new, but something about Susan's smile, tight, rehearsed, put her on edge. You made your position clear, Claire said. You tried to take what wasn't yours. You lied in a legal proceeding. You've done enough. Susan's voice turned softer. But we're still your parents, Claire. You can't just erase that. Claire tilted her head. You did that yourselves. 15 years ago. There was a pause. Dennis tried again. We're not proud of the past. We made mistakes. But maybe this blessing Margaret left you, maybe it's a second chance for all of us. Claire's hands curled slightly on the doorframe. You think money is what this is about? No, Susan said quickly. It's about family. Claire gave a short, disbelieving breath through her nose. Then Susan stepped forward. Her tone changed. But if you're going to keep pretending we were monsters, maybe we should tell people what Margaret really was. You think people won't listen? You think the press wouldn't care about what really happened in that house? Claire narrowed her eyes. What are you implying? I'm saying, Dennis cut in, that people love scandal. And when a rich woman dies and leaves everything to a girl she adopted behind closed doors, there are questions. Claire didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly opened the door wider and stepped into the porch light. Then she looked up directly at the security camera mounted above the doorframe. It's all being recorded, she said evenly, and I've already contacted the local sheriff's office after the last incident. You're both on a trespassing watch list. One more step and I call them. Susan's jaw clenched. Dennis turned red. We're not threats, he snapped. We're trying to find common ground. No, Claire said softly. You're trying to find a new angle. Dennis scoffed. You can buy all the houses you want. But money doesn't buy family. You'll see that one day. Claire's face didn't change. Not even a flicker of emotion. You're right, she replied. Money doesn't buy family. That's why Margaret never needed to. She built one with trust and sacrifice and consistency, with action, not apologies. The words hung there for a moment, heavy, final. Susan's eyes welled, but it was no longer clear whether the tears were real or performative. Dennis muttered something under his breath, turned, and began walking back down the steps. Susan hesitated for one last second, searching Claire's face. But there was nothing left to find. Claire closed the door. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Instead, she walked back to the kitchen, picked up her mug, and poured herself a fresh cup of tea. For the first time since all of this had begun, she realized she wasn't carrying their weight anymore. It had finally, fully fallen away. Claire had avoided the room for weeks. Since the funeral, since the legal battles, since the final confrontation on her doorstep, she had walked past the door at the end of the hallway countless times, always pausing, sometimes placing a hand on the doorknob, but never going in. Until now. It was late morning. A soft rain tapped against the windows, and the air inside the house carried the hush of a Sunday with nowhere to be. Claire stood in front of Margaret's bedroom, her breath steady, her hand firm on the knob this time. She opened it slowly, and a wave of familiar scent met her Margaret's perfume. Faint now, but unmistakable. A warm floral note that immediately pulled Claire back through years of quiet mornings and bedtime hugs. She stepped inside. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it. The bed made tightly, the lace pillow shams perfectly arranged, the dresser neat, the jewelry box closed, untouched. A silk scarf draped on the chair near the window, and Claire reached out and touched it, fingers grazing the fabric like it might dissolve if she pressed too hard. She walked slowly around the room, not quite knowing what she was looking for. There was no goal, just a need. On the desk sat a wooden box Claire didn't remember seeing before. Dark walnut, polished smooth, with a brass latch that wasn't locked. She opened it carefully. Inside were photographs. Not just any photographs. These were hers. Claire, as a child, awkward smile missing a front tooth. Claire at 15, holding a violin she never truly learned to play. Claire at graduation, eyes red from crying. Margaret's arm gently around her shoulder. Claire in her first job, her first apartment, her first birthday away from home. Each photo had been dated in Margaret's neat handwriting on the back. Some had notes. Her first piano recital, she hated every second. She passed math after 3 tutors, never gave up. This is the day I knew she would be just fine. Claire set the photos down, blinking fast. There was more. A yellowed newspaper clipping, carefully laminated. An article praising Margaret's design firm, with a quote about mentorship and second chances. Below it, folded neatly, was an old letter addressed simply, "For Claire, only when you're ready." Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dear girl, I never expected to be your mother. I wasn't sure I'd be any good at it. I still don't know if I was. But I tried. Every day I tried. You were angry for a long time. I don't blame you. I never asked you to love me. I only hoped I could give you enough peace that one day love might grow in its place. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But if you're reading it, I trust you've lived. You've survived what came before, and you're building what comes next. That's all I ever wanted. Be strong, be kind, be free. Love always. M." Claire folded the letter slowly. Her chest tightened. There was no dramatic sob, no cinematic collapse to the floor, just a soft, unshakable ache that filled her from the inside out. A deep, still grief wrapped in gratitude. She stayed in the room for hours, looking through every drawer, every item Margaret had kept. Some were ordinary, a pair of old reading glasses, a receipt for garden soil, a scrap of fabric from a reupholstered chair, but every object held meaning now, like they were fragments of a woman who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. When the rain stopped, Claire stood and walked to the mirror over the dresser. She looked at herself, really looked. The woman staring back wasn't the frightened girl from years ago, or the defensive young woman in the lawyer's office. She was someone else now. That evening, she filled out the paperwork online. 3 weeks later, Claire stood before a county clerk and submitted her request to legally change her name. She brought Margaret's letter. The judge didn't ask why. He saw the folder of documents, the years of adoption papers, the articles about Margaret's mentorship and generosity, the small but growing charitable donations Claire had begun making under a new foundation name. He simply nodded and said, "It's clear you've thought this through." Claire left the courthouse with a new ID. Claire Whitmore. Not adopted. Not borrowed. Not temporary. Chosen. Rooted. Proud. It wasn't about shedding her past. It was about honoring the woman who saved her from it. The name Whitmore meant more to Claire now than any sum of money or legal title ever could. It carried Margaret's legacy, the woman who had saved her, raised her, and expected nothing in return. Claire had chosen it not just as a surname, but as a compass. And with that compass, she knew exactly where she was headed. The decision came naturally, as though Margaret had whispered it into her heart. Claire began the groundwork for a foundation. She called it the Whitmore Foundation, a tribute not only to Margaret's name, but to the principles she lived by: strength, dignity, and quiet compassion. The foundation's mission was clear: supporting young people who had aged out of the foster system or those who had been left behind like she had been once. It would provide practical aid, transitional housing, vocational scholarships, therapy, legal counseling. But beyond all that, it would offer something rarer presence: someone to show up, someone to listen, someone to believe in them. Claire poured herself into the project. She met with social workers, hired a small team of dedicated staff, and leased a modest building near the city center. The sign out front read, "Whitmore House, you're not alone." And for Claire, that message mattered more than any dollar amount on a check. One afternoon, just before the official launch of the Foundation's pilot program, Claire received a call. It was from a community worker who'd been helping connect at-risk youth with local services. A name came up: Ryan. Claire had been keeping quiet tabs on him since their brief interaction weeks ago, back when she'd helped him find housing without revealing who she truly was. Now, she felt it was time. She arranged to meet Ryan at a quiet coffee shop downtown. He walked in slowly, eyes scanning the room until he spotted her. He looked healthier than before, more rested, still wary. "Claire, right?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She nodded. "Thanks for coming." They talked casually for a few minutes: jobs, how he'd been doing, how the new place was working out. He said he'd been applying to a local trade school's HVAC program. "Seems practical," he said with a shrug. Claire nodded, then took a slow breath. "I haven't been honest with you," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. I didn't come into your life by accident. Ryan looked confused, then guarded. What do you mean? Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside was a copy of the same documentation Harold had once shown her. The birth records, the parental signatures, the proof. Ryan, she said softly, I'm your sister. He stared at her, frozen. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He blinked hard. No way. Claire let the silence stretch, giving him room. Dennis and Susan, she continued. They left me when I was 13, but they left you, even earlier. Ryan sat back in his chair, staring at the table. He didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but dry. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know, Claire said. You deserve better than silence, and because you're not alone anymore. He looked at her again. Longer this time. I thought I was, he said quietly. My whole life. Claire reached across the table. She didn't touch his hand. She just left hers there, palm up, an open invitation. Ryan stared at it, then finally placed his hand in hers. I'm not asking for anything, she said. I just want you to know you have family. Real family. No strings. They sat there like that for a while. No more words needed. Later that week, Ryan came to Whitmore House. He walked the halls slowly, listened to the staff explain how the programs worked. When offered a full scholarship to pursue his trade school education, he hesitated. I don't want to take advantage, he said. You're not, Claire replied. You're taking a step forward. That's what this place is for. He accepted. On one condition, he'd volunteer part-time at the house. I know what it's like to show up somewhere and feel like nobody wants you there, he said. I don't want anyone else to feel that. Claire smiled. Deal. Days later, while checking mail at the foundation's office, Claire found a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten in shaky cursive. It was from Susan. Claire, I don't expect you to forgive me. You shouldn't. But I'm sorry. Truly. I see it now, what we did, what we lost, what you became in spite of us. If this letter reaches you, it means I finally had the courage to face it. If you never respond, I'll understand. But I hope, one day, you'll know that I regret every step that took me away from you. Merci roi. Nếu quá muộn, cứ đừng trả lời. Claire held the letter in her hand for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't get angry. She simply folded it, placed it in a drawer, and moved on with her day. Some debts get repaid in cash, others in silence. Claire had already paid hers with forgiveness, with courage, and with the promise that no child she met through the Whitmore Foundation would ever feel as forgotten as she once had. The morning was quiet, and the air was crisp as Claire stepped out of her car, bouquet in hand. The sky above the cemetery stretched gray and still, and the trees surrounding the stone path stood solemn like quiet sentinels. She walked slowly, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground, each step deliberate. She'd been here before, of course, on the day of Margaret's burial, flanked by Harold and a handful of former colleagues, neighbors, and old friends. But this was the first time she came alone. The first time not as a grieving niece, or the bewildered heiress, or the woman caught in a storm of unwanted family and legal battles. Today, she came as a daughter. She stopped in front of the headstone. It was simple and elegant, just as Margaret would have wanted. Her name etched in clean serif font, Margaret A. Whitmore, 1950, 2025. Below that, it had originally read, Architect, Mentor, Friend, but that wasn't enough. Claire had arranged to have it changed a week earlier, and now, as she stood there, she saw the new words beneath her name. Chiseled carefully, the letters stood proud in the morning light. Beloved Mother. Claire felt her chest tighten. Her eyes welled, not with the kind of grief that shattered her, but the kind that soaked deep and quiet, the kind that stayed. She knelt and laid the bouquet of white peonies gently at the base of the stone. Margaret had always loved peonies. Reaching into her coat pocket, Claire pulled out a folded piece of paper. She'd written it the night before, then rewritten it twice. But now, with the letter in her hands, she didn't need to read it. She unfolded it anyway. "I wasn't born to you," she read aloud softly, her voice breaking on the first words. "But I was brought back to life because of you. You didn't give me your blood. You gave me your breath, your rules, your endless patience, your silence when I needed to cry, your words when I needed to rise." A breeze stirred her hair as if the wind was listening. "I used to think being left behind would define me, but now I know being chosen saved me. You didn't have to love me, but you did. With every act, every day, every meal, every deadline reminder, every cup of tea after a long cry." She paused and wiped a tear with the back of her hand. "You weren't perfect, and you never asked me to be, but you taught me what it means to stand up, to speak, and to let go when it's time. I hope I'm doing right by you. I hope I'm building something you'd be proud of. And I hope you know your name lives on, not because you left me money, but because you left me love, and I will spend the rest of my life passing it on." Claire folded the letter slowly, kissed it, and placed it beneath the bouquet. She stayed a while longer, seated on the bench nearby. In the quiet, she didn't feel alone. She could almost hear Margaret's voice, the stern tone she used when Claire skipped piano practice, the warm chuckle when she'd burned the toast again, the rare, quiet hum she made when reading on the porch. Claire closed her eyes and breathed in deep. This was peace. Not closure, because love like that doesn't close. It transforms. Later that afternoon, back at her office, Claire answered a call from a national talk show. The producer's voice was friendly, enthusiastic. They'd heard about the Whitmore Foundation, seen the press release about its mission and impact. But more than that, they'd read about Claire's story. "We'd love to have you come on," the producer said, "and share your perspective on chosen family, what it means to love someone not because you have to, but because you believe in them." Claire smiled. She looked out the window of the foundation's modest building, where two teens sat under the awning chatting with one of the caseworkers. She saw Ryan in the distance, waving from the sidewalk before heading off to his evening class. "Yes," she said into the phone. "I'd be honored." She hung up and turned toward the framed photo on her desk. Margaret, holding baby Claire at a local park, both squinting into the sun. The caption beneath the frame read, "Her choice, my beginning." Claire Whitmore rose from her chair, smoothed the front of her blazer, and stepped into the hallway. Her stride was sure. Her voice, when she greeted a new visitor moments later, was clear, warm, and steady. She had not just survived. She had become everything they said she couldn't, and more. Claire's story isn't just about revenge. It's about choice. The choice between blood and love, between bitterness and grace, between abandonment and legacy. When life leaves you behind, you can choose to harden. Or, like Claire, you can choose to rise. And through the quiet, unwavering love of a woman who never had to stay but did, Claire rebuilt not only her own life but the lives of others. If you've ever felt forgotten, discarded, or betrayed, let this story be a reminder. You can rewrite your ending. You can become the person they never thought you could be, stronger, wiser, and free. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Claire's shoes? Would you have forgiven or walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe stories like this need to be told more often, tap, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one, because people like Claire and people like you deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching all the way through. I'll see you in the next story.